I don't know what I like best, the groans when they say I'm going to be speaking 20 to 22 minutes, or the fact that I'm going to make that red light before it goes off so I don't get treated like this poor guy got treated.
Tough crowd.
Now, I was here last week, and Mr. Flaherty asked me a question during Table Topics. He says, don't we have an obligation to fulfill our treaties in regards to the Iran Appeasement Treaty? I don't know if you use the word Iran Appeasement Treaty, but basically that's what it is. And then I did my best to cram a 20 to 22 minute speech into a minute and a half. And realized I was not quite succeeding. But then later, Hank stood up and said, well, Eric did a great job. He spoke for a minute and a half and gave us all that great information. On the other hand, Larry over there, he only spoke for 30 seconds. At which point Larry turns around and says, yes, well, I was concise, unlike Eric spewing all that word vomit. So I figured if I had to talk about something, this would be my time to try and make up for that, trying to cram 20 to 22 minutes into a minute and a half. Mr. Netanyahu stood up recently and said, Iran lied. He had this big thing on television where he showed 330 CDs. He showed probably about 1,000 different binders. And all of this was about Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. And the reason that Iran is lying is they had stated previously that all of their research into nuclear energy was going to be for peaceful purposes. And therefore they were not in violation of the non-proliferation treaty that they had signed back in 1970. They had been a party to this treaty that said, we're not going to pursue nuclear weapons. Well, now we have 330 CDs and 1,000 binders that prove that they were doing exactly that from the years 1970 to 2003. They had lied. They had been pursuing it not because they needed energy, but because they wanted to have a nuclear weapon. They saw how North Korea bullies everybody around when it has a weapon. They saw how Libya, Gaddafi ended up losing his power because he gave up his nuclear weapon. So they wanted to have one. Nuclear weapons give you power. America has the power whenever it decides to use it. So I give kudos to Mr. Netanyahu for having the integrity to say, here's the evidence. Not only you in America, not only you, Mr. President Trump, are going to believe us, but now maybe even the Europeans will wake up and realize that the primary reason that they want the appeasement treaty is so that they can sell anything to Iran. Iran likes to buy stuff, especially stuff that has a dual use capability. They used to buy a bunch of centrifuges from Germany. Germany makes ball bearings extremely well. They make them so well that they don't cause a lot of friction, and therefore they're perfect for centrifuges. And centrifuges is how you take uranium and you refine it from 5%, which is what it normally is, all the way up to 90%, which is what is necessary in order to make a nuclear weapon. So now Germany can start selling them ball bearings, and they will claim they don't know how those ball bearings are going to be used, but because the sanctions have been revoked, who knows what Iran's going to do with the ball bearings. And you have Boeing selling, even here in America, a whole bunch of planes and a whole bunch of technology associated with our latest planes. Boeing's not too happy that we reimpose sanctions. I guess that's one of the cons of not wanting to do business with Iran, is that Boeing isn't going to make as much money. However, there's not a big difference between learning how to make planes or buying the planes that Boeing makes and breaking those planes apart and figuring out how to manufacture your own planes for military use. So these dual use technologies we're now not going to be selling to Iran, which we know can't be trusted because they signed the non-nuclear proliferation treaty and they ditched it as soon as they could. What other types of sanctions are being imposed on Iran right now? President Trump has imposed new sanctions on the banks that finance Iran's oil production. And this is similar to why North Korea is now at the table and telling us that they may get rid of their nuclear weapons. Now, first of all, I don't believe a single thing that North Korea says. We have 30 or 40 years of analyzing every treaty that they've ever made, and every single one they've lied and gone back on, and this one's not going to be any different. They just want to last longer than President Trump because no one else is going to have the ability or the chutzpah to actually invade their country. So they'll do whatever they can for the next 6-8 years until he's no longer around. But what we did to get them to the table is we put pressure on China not to buy the coal that is being produced by North Korea. That's really the only thing they manufacture that anybody wants, is coal. Well, in addition to their nuclear technology, which they've exported to Pakistan and also Iran. So, they come to the table when sanctions are imposed. That's why Iran came to the table to make this deal. And what happened as a result of the deal that was made with President Obama? They had a 40% increase in their military budget in the last 3 years. So us taking away sanctions allowed them to increase their military 40%. It's 15.4% of their whole budget. Prior to that sanctions going into effect, they were experiencing a 1.3% per year contraction in their gross domestic product. We were hurting them, and we were hurting them badly. They were shrinking. Now, we don't really like the fact that there's people there who are suffering, but when you have a theocratic regime that chants death to America on a weekly basis every time they lead their weekly prayer, you probably don't want them getting more powerful, and you don't want them having military budgets that increase 40% per year. It's only a matter of time till they start doing stuff that they've already been doing, like they've been doing in Syria. Since we've reimposed sanctions, the currency in Iran has fallen by 50%. So the rest of the world is waking up saying, wow, finally America means business, and this means Iran is not going to have the same assets that it used to have. It's not going to have the same earning power. And maybe we shouldn't be investing there. Maybe we should be selling everything we have and getting out. And that's how currency loses 50% of its value. So there are real effects associated with these sanctions, whether they're in place or they've been revoked. So let's go back and look at the question that John asked me last week. He said, don't we have an obligation to fulfill our treaty? Well, it is a treaty if the Senate had approved it. There's 60 people in the Senate who would have had to approve it in order for it to be a binding treaty. Obama never submitted it to the Senate because he knew he'd never get 60 votes. And because he never submitted it, it was not a binding treaty. So we are not going back on our word by deciding that we're no longer going to honor it. Now, did Iran ratify the treaty? No. They have a similar process where they have to go and conduct a plebiscite because the ruler over there likes to, make it look like there's some semblance of democracy to keep their people from going out and revolting. But because we didn't do it, it would have been humiliating for them to go have their own plebiscite with their own people who would have voted any way as they told them to in their little council. So they never submitted it to their council either. So it was never ratified in America. It was never ratified in Iran. There is no treaty. That's why everyone refers to it as a deal. It's not a treaty. There was 3 elements that could have been dealt with effectively in this agreement. One would have been the pursuit of nuclear technology. The second could have been the pursuit of ballistic missiles. And the third, the support of terrorism. Now, supposedly this agreement that was put together in a lackadaisical fashion by John Kerry, who violated the Logan Law recently by trying to continue to keep that treaty in effect, even though he has no government position. The nuclear secrets that were uncovered by Iran shows that the nuclear element of that agreement were not being followed. They're not being adhered to. They were still warehousing all the information that they should never have had in the first place, and they were adding to it. Not for a peaceful energy, but for nuclear weapons. The second element was ballistic missiles. Now, we've all been seeing what happens over North Korea when they've been testing their nuclear missiles. And they've been getting better and better. And the better that they can be delivered, their goal was to try and miniaturize a nuclear device, put it on top of one of the missiles, and they were bragging about how much better their missiles were getting. I mean, it seemed like every 2 or 3 weeks we were opening up the newspaper and seeing like a little radius of how far from North Korea their weapons program were now going to allow them to deliver these potentially nuclear warheads. And it kept getting longer and longer and longer until it covered Guam. Now, most of us don't, or maybe haven't visited Guam, but Guam is American territory, so we shouldn't just write it off if it gets nuked. And Alaska was starting to get in there, and it was getting closer and closer to someplace that might actually be important to some of us, like Seattle or San Diego. So it was important for us to try and prevent their nuclear technology from getting better and better. Even though I did have one speech in which I talked about how they can put it on a cargo container and send it over into one of our ports and just detonate it and have the same effect. They don't even have to put it on missiles. And that's the problem that you have with people who have nuclear technology. You have to trust that they're not going to nuke you somehow. And we could trust the Soviets to lie only a little bit on their treaties. So for example, when we did the anti-ballistic missile treaty, they built a radar system they were not supposed to build. And we went ahead and went to the Israelis and said, why don't you develop Iron Dome? We're not allowed to do it, but we'll sort of cooperate with you and fund the whole thing so that when we decide to get out of this treaty, we have an anti-ballistic missile system that works 25% of the time, which is better than nothing, and we can build on that. So we cheated, they cheated, but we did it in small amounts and we sort of knew what each other were doing. That's not the way these other countries cheat. These other countries cheat and lie like it's something they love doing. And I hate saying this, but I have personal experience from some of the people who come from those countries, and I try and sell them stuff, and believe me, they negotiate for a living. They love it. They go into grocery stores and they try and negotiate with the teller. I don't want to pay $2.35 for this cheese. I only want to pay $1.50. And that's horrible when you're like behind 20 of these people, and about 40 minutes later you get to the front. That's part of their culture. That's what they do, and that's not bad, just negotiating, but sometimes they lie and cheat and steal and don't pay their taxes and do other stuff. So we know what amount of cheating that other countries will do, but nobody seems to understand the amount of cheating that Iran likes to do until, kudos to Netanyahu, he showed us all. What else do they do? Terrorism. They've been supporting Hezbollah, the Taliban, the Yemen rebels, and Al-Qaeda. And we have proof of all that stuff. Recently Israel said, we're tired of Hezbollah being given all these weapons by the Iranians, we're going to go blow them up. So there's been in the last couple of months, the Israelis have blown up 4 different bases that are out in Syria, and it's been said in the mainstream media, which usually doesn't tell the truth, but in this case I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, that 27 Iranians were killed in those bombings. Now, what were the Iranians doing there? Well, they're doing the same thing that America's doing. America is fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS there, so we have 2,400 advisors that are there trying to fight against these Al-Qaeda remnants. And that's what Iran has. Iran has their, quote, advisors, except their advisors, now that they've handled ISIS and gotten rid of them, are now focusing on their next biggest threat, which is Israel. They hate Israel. They hate what you need to know about the Iranians is they're mostly Shiites. And here in America, we don't think religion is anything worth fighting over. Not in the Middle East. They will fight over religion all day long, because they all get to go to heaven if they die trying to kill somebody who's a heathen. Or at least that's what they think. So the Iranian Shiites hate the Sunnis, and the Sunnis hate the Shiites. And Iraq used to be 20% Sunni and 80% Shiite, and it was run by a dictator who we all hated, who we ended up invading and getting rid of, Saddam Hussein. And then we instituted democracy, which works here in America because everyone doesn't hate each other here in America. And what immediately happened? All the Shiites, the 80% who've been abused by the Sunnis for years and years and years under Saddam Hussein, said, we're in charge now, and you Sunnis and you Christians who had favored status before, watch what happens to you now. And they blitzkrieged all over Iraq, destroyed the whole place, and ISIS actually had some sympathy from the other Sunnis because they're Sunnis. They're Sunni extremists who like to butcher and kill, and they don't meet our standards of being a good, viable opposition party, but that's what they got. They got the ISIS as the antidote to the Shiites taking over the whole government in the form of democracy, which we thought would work great and works well when people don't hate each other enough to go out and kill each other all the time. So now the Shiites under Iran are funding Hezbollah, Taliban, Yemen rebels, and Al-Qaeda, and they're doing it with money from Iran. Let's talk about one of the other things that was part of this appeasement treaty. The appeasement treaty said we'd have the right to go and inspect anywhere in the country as long as we gave them 24 days notice, not hours, 24 days notice, and we weren't allowed to inspect any of their military installations. Now here in America, the government owns a quarter of the property, a third of the property. It's pretty easy to hide anything on government property and call it a military installation here in America. I assume that Iran does the same thing. So in other words, you can't inspect any place where they're actually developing nuclear weapons or missile technology or funding Al-Qaeda camps. In addition, before we could actually give 24 days notice, we had to get all of our partners in the agreement, meaning European, Germans, and British, and French, who are making money selling all of these items to Iran, to have a vote. So we'd have to get them all together and have them vote. This is a massive ceding of the power that the United States has. Since when do we put the power and the security of our country in the hands of anybody else? I don't care if it's the Pope who gets to decide. Since when do we take our power and say, oh, we have to have a vote and see if they're really evading these sanctions? And proof of this is that when we decided to cancel this treaty, the European Union came out and said that our United States president has no right to unilaterally scrap the treaty. The European Union thinks they have the right to dictate to our president, our elected representative, what he's allowed to do for the security of fellow Americans. It's perfect. We couldn't have asked for something more perfect to show the moral bankruptcy of our European partners. $1.7 billion was released to the Iranian regime by President Obama. That's U.S. taxpayer money, by the way. We paid for that in order to get 4 hostages freed at the time that this deal was signed. Now, it was $400 million at the time, but it was later increased by another $1.3 million. Well, it came to $1.7 billion when you're done. You can't do the math under all of this focused adoration from everybody in the audience. Now, that $1.7 billion, $1 billion immediately went to their military budget. It's uncanny. We gave them money and they immediately used it to fight Israel and the United States. Wow, who could have imagined that? One other thing that everyone seems to forget is President Trump ran under the promise that he was going to revoke this deal. He's actually fulfilling a campaign promise. Now, when's the last time we saw a politician actually fulfill their campaign promises? Every politician for the last 20 years has promised the Jewish demographic group in this country that they would move the embassy to Jerusalem. And every single one of them, when they got into office, did not do that. With the exception, President Trump, who actually fulfilled his promises. Something to remember the next time you hear somebody say that Trump is a liar. Well, all politicians are, but he keeps the promises he made to those who voted him in. And I would give him credit for that. Let's see, death to America, I think I covered that. Iran chants that. They have a weekly prayer meeting which they chant, death to Israel, death to America. You know, Hitler had a book, it's called Mein Kampf. And in Mein Kampf, 3 or 4 times per page, he talked about how he hated the Jews and how the Germans were suffering because of the Jews and how we needed to extinguish the Jews. I had to read some of this in college. I couldn't get more than 4 or 5 pages before I had to throw it down and discuss. There's a similar book that's out there that's published by the leaders of Iran that says almost the same thing. It's like they just translated Mein Kampf into Iranian. And there's still people in this country who say, oh, well, we're just going to give them a pass on that. They don't really mean it. Really? Just like Hitler didn't really mean it. Yeah, well, we learned from that one, didn't we? Appeasement doesn't work. Now, One of the things that the treaty did do is it got rid of about a third of their centrifuges. But what John Kerry doesn't want to admit is we'd already broken that third of the centrifuges with Stuxnet. Stuxnet was something sort of like Iron Dome. It was a secret, clandestine computer program that America and the Israelis worked on that forced the centrifuges to run too fast. And when they ran too fast, they burned up. And a third of them who ran really fast burned up and couldn't be fixed. So the only centrifuges they gave up as part of the treaty are the ones we'd already broken. It's rather deceitful for John Kerry to come to us and say, look, they gave up a third of their centrifuges. Aren't they wonderful? No, they're not wonderful. We'd already broken them. John Kerry's a liar too. I wish he was here so I could tell him that. Any deal is only as good as the honesty of the people who sign it. Haven't we learned that from North Korea? North Korea has broken 20 to 30 years of agreements. And Iran is doing the same thing. Now, I talked earlier about 1.7 billion, but something that hasn't been discussed is there's $50 billion in frozen assets that were released to the Iranians as a result of us not being on a wartime footing with them anymore. So now it's not just 1.7 billion, it's 50 billion. They had a 40% increase in their military budget, and they had a 13.4% increase in their gross domestic product once that treaty was put into effect. Now we're going back down to a 1.3 contraction. Kudos to President Trump for making America great again. Fellow Toastmasters.